All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome.
Hello.
You have some back feed.
Mm-hmm.
If you could go ahead and mute yourselves. I think Karen just did that. Okay. Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. Welcome. And thank you for participating in today's FDOT District 5 Roadside Chat Series. I am Claudia Calzaretta, the FDOT Florida Scenic Highway Program Coordinator for District 5. The roadside chats were developed as a way to connect and draw the byway community closer together by sharing valuable information. For those of you on the call that have been with us for previous chats, thank you and welcome back. And for those that are new to the series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Our byways offer such a unique experience. Each comes with its unique story to tell, stories that program, one of the best off the beaten path experiences in Florida. This series is open to anyone and everyone, so please feel free to share within your network. This doesn't cost anybody anything, so feel free to share and participate. As we've done with some previous chats, this presentation today will be hosted by one of our byways. Today's host will be the Green Mountain Scenic Byway, and our guest speaker is Mr. Phil Cross of the Central Florida Railway Historical Society, which is located on the byway. Before introducing Mr. Cross, let me first introduce Greg Gensheimer. Greg is the chair of the Green Mountain Scenic Byway, and he's going to provide a brief introduction. Take it away, Greg. Thank you.
All right. And Karen, can you go back to that other, to the first slide? I was going to make a joke for those people that don't know who I am, that I actually am the one without the hair. But with me in that picture is Mona Phipps, and she was one of the key members for the entire establishment of Green Mountain Scenic Byway. She's been a phenomenal volunteer in Central Florida. She was chairman of Friends of Lake Apopka. She was president of Oakland Nature Preserve. She worked with Jim Thomas, and if everybody doesn't know who Jim Thomas is, he just died a little bit more than 3 weeks ago, and he was one of the drivers of turning the north shore of Lake Apopka from farmland into wetlands. And over the last couple of weeks, I've been up there more often than not, giving little introductions about what the North Shore was, and it was just a wonderful memorial every single time I talked to one more person that was driving or bicycling or doing something on the North Shore, to say that Jim Thomas started this 50 years ago, and what a memorial for all these happy people, thousands of people using the North Shore Restoration Area, and I thought that was really cool. So I just wanted to introduce Mona along the way. Next slide. Green Mountain has had some really big changes. First designated in 2004. It just took us a couple of years. We extended from the Lake Orange County boundary into Oakland, and then a couple of years longer, we extended into Winter Garden. And then Mount Dora said, hey, what about extending up to us? And that 45 miles, and there's a picture in the next couple of slides, but the 45 miles shows additional spurs that we established so that we could connect even more recreational opportunities to the visitors and travelers along the byway. Next slide. Byway community, and here's the lower left is the map, and you can see it's not a continuous route. There's different kind of spurs. There's two that go south towards the lake, and there's one that goes east. Those are for access to that North Shore Restoration Area, which is 20,000 acres now of wetlands. And then there's a little jut going to the west, and that's the Little Lake Harris. So the byway communities, Winter Garden, Ferndale, Oakland, Astatula, Montverde, Mineola, Mount Dora, and Claremont. And over the last, say, 5, 6, 7 years, Mineola and Claremont kind of established themselves along the byway by annexing properties. Both those cities were not really on the byway, and now all of a sudden, their contiguous boundaries, cross the byway in different places. And that picture in the middle with the truck going down there, unfortunately, all of that is going to be houses or strip malls or buildings. When the byway was established, we went from the Lake Orange County boundary, just west of Oakland and south of the lake, and we went to a little lost community called Howey Heights. And Phil and I talked about that before we got on. It was just a railroad depot that was out in the middle of nowhere, and that was what the original byway was. Everything around it was burnt out orange groves. And here pretty soon, the only places that we're going to have that are going to be green are the resources that we helped develop, which is Lake Apopka. We worked on the West Orange Trail, the South Lake Trail. We worked with anybody and everybody to establish trails and open up the North Shore Restoration Area. As I said, Mona was, president and one of the founders of the Oakland Nature Preserve. Montverde Academy has been there forever, and Glenn Burns and I worked with the county to have the county purchase the Ferndale Preserve, and we did that right at the height of the housing bubble. So 195 acres that's waterfront to Lake Apopka. Next slide, please. Who are we? We've changed an awful lot in the last 20 years. When I was working full time and trying to help out the byway, we were really community planners, where we were working with the individual municipalities along the byway to try to get the objectives, strategies, and goals of our byway, into the comprehensive plans of each of those municipalities. Now that we've done that and we've gone through boom and bust for developers, and now we're into another boom time, we have enough recreational opportunities that we're now economic developers, and our goal is pretty much to still try to save any kinds of properties that we can, but to link the travelers and the visitors to the businesses that are nearby. One of the things that's been ongoing in the picture to the lower right is Gary Baylog that is looking out over the scenic overlook. One of the long-term projects is trying to actually build an extra tall tower right at that overlook. And then the plat map just to the 8 o'clock of that picture, one of those parcels is the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, the highest point in Central Florida at 312 feet. And we have an opportunity. It's mild opportunity, not even 50-50, but we want to put a passive park up on the top of Sugarloaf Mountain. And if we get that opportunity, then we don't have to really build one, because the scenic overlook is about 200 feet down below the top of the hill. So I would much prefer having a passive park and some kind of an observation tower way higher up. And then we can legitimately claim to be, way higher than the Bach Tower down in Lake Wales. Next slide, please. Byway facts, I mentioned Glenn Burns. He was really the visionary, and he's in the picture down below with the three gentlemen. The one to the left is Gallus Quigley, Lake County Parks and Trails, and self-avowed best birder that has ever been around. I'm in the middle, and Glenn Burns is the one in the back. As I mentioned, we started off with thousands of acres of burnout orange groves. Now we've got thousands of acres of rooftops and roads, and they're coming in just as fast as they can bulldoze the hills and knock the trees down. We still are home to the highest point in peninsular Florida, and there is a community around the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, so no bulldozers will be allowed to get in there and knock that down by 20 or 30 or 50 or 70 feet. So we'll still have the highest point in Central Florida. And Claudia has been doing top tens, and we've got some pretty wonderful restaurants and resources and some haunted houses. And I'm really happy that we also have the Central Florida Railroad right along our byway. And we've got contact information to the right. And I want to give Phil as much time as he can to present his information because I'm excited to hear it. There we go.
Thank
Claudia?
you, Greg. And Phil, you can take it away. You're on mute, Phil.
We okay now?
Yes, you're perfect. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate in today's Roadside Chat and to speak to you about Florida's railroad history. Central Florida history and Central Florida railroad history have always been my favorites to research and learn about and to speak to others about. We'll first take a minute and tell you a little bit about the Central Florida Railway Historical Society. It was organized in 1970, originally as the Central Florida chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. The membership decided in 2013 to withdraw from the national organization and form their own local organization, the Central Florida Railway Historical Society. Our current membership is 103. And our mission is promoting railway heritage and preservation and educating members and the public about rail transportation, its history and impact with a focus on Central Florida. Next slide, please. The museum that was mentioned earlier, the Central Florida Railroad Museum, is housed in the former Tiberias and Gulf Railroad Depot in Winter Garden. It was opened to the public in May of 1983. In 2003, the chapter at that time joined forces with the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation, allowing the museum to be open up to 7 days per week with a paid host. Currently, the museum is open 11 to 3, Tuesday through Saturday of each week. And in 2019, we hosted over 10,500 visitors. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will cover the topics that you see listed here. This will cover a span of 188 years, from 1834 to 2022. Next slide, please. Florida's first railroads. The first railroad in Florida was the Tallahassee Railroad Company. It was organized in 1834 to build a line from Tallahassee to St. Marks. We were not the first railroad in the U.S., but we were not far behind the first railroad in the U.S., which was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which began in 1832. So we were only 2 years behind that first railroad. You can see the list here of other railroads that were established in Florida between 1835 and 1859. If you look at the map, it's not as large as I would have liked it to have been, but it's the best I could provide at the time. You can see that most of these early railroads were located in North Florida and in Northwest Florida in the Panhandle. Next slide, please. At the start of the Civil War, we had 433 miles of railroad that had been constructed and was operating in Florida. The list there shows the completed mileage of the lines that were in Florida at that time. The longest being the Florida Railroad at 155 miles in length between Fernandina and Cedar Key. The map, again, at the left shows you that, again, most of these railroads, if not all of them, were in North Florida and Northwest Florida. Okay, next slide, please. Florida seaports were the primary targets for the Northern forces. Florida had seaports that fell early in the conflict. Defense of those seaports and the shorelines was minimal due to there was being a lot of shoreline and minimal troops were available to defend. Equipment, terminals, and tracks were seized. Most were destroyed or made inoperable. Some trackage was removed by the Southern forces to keep the Northern forces from using the railroads and destroying them further. And following the end of the conflict, the daunting task of rebuilding the destroyed railroad lines began in earnest and was well underway by the middle of 1866. Next slide, please. Into the 70s, rebuilding of the railroads continued well into the 1870s, and there were a few new railroads constructed during this decade, again, most all of them being in North Florida and Northwest Florida. And by the 1870s, steamboats were now plying most of the river systems in Florida, bringing supplies and tourists in and taking lumber, agricultural products, and tourists out. Roads were few and poor at best. By 1880, there were 500 miles of railroads operating in Florida, less than 70 miles more than before the start of the Civil War. So very little was constructed in this 10-year period. And again, most of them were in North Florida and in the Panhandle area. Next slide, please. But things took a turn beginning in the early 1880s. That was the start of the railroad expansion in Florida from 1880 to 1930. And during this period, railroads impacted Florida in a positive manner by helping to establish new towns and cities and serving the lumber, phosphate, manufacturing, agricultural, and tourist industries. And by 1890, there were 2,000 miles of railroad trackage in Florida. The majority of the expansion was southward, as you can hopefully see by this map. Things were moving into Central Florida and the upper part of South Florida. So in 10 years, we were able to build 1,500 miles of additional railroads. Next slide, please. And by 1900, there were more than 3,000 miles of railroad trackage. So we added another 1,000 miles. And the expansion had continued southward and reached Miami on the East Coast and Fort Myers on the West Coast. And during this period, many new railroads were built, but some didn't last long before falling either into bankruptcy or being bought out or absorbed by other successful railroads. There were a number of railroads, several hundred railroads constructed in this time. Many of them did not last very long. By 1910, things were starting to come together through mergers, buyouts, and reorganizations to indicate that there would be six major railroads in Florida, along with a number of independent short-line railroads. Next slide, please. And by 1930, the major railroads had completed the majority of their expansions and acquisitions. They were all the way to Miami and even out to Key West. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad and the Seaboard Airline Railway were fierce competitors throughout Florida, the peninsula of Florida. If you look at the map on the left, that's the Atlantic Coastline. You can see their trackage, how it went down through the peninsula of Florida. And the same area on the map on the right, the seaboard's trackage. Again, in this area, many of the towns were served by both the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard Airline. And again, they were fierce competitors for the trade that was available. The map in the center shows the Florida East Coast Railway, which primarily followed the east coast of our great state all the way to Key West. It does show a line on the interior leaving Titusville, coming south to Lake Okeechobee. And then later, after 1930, there was another branch line for the FEC that left Fort Pierce, headed southwest around the bottom side of Lake Okeechobee. Next slide, please. Florida had two railroad barons, and just by chance, both of them had a first name of Henry. The first was Henry Flagler. He was born in 1830. He was an American industrialist and a founder of Standard Oil. He was also a key figure in the development of the Atlantic coast of Florida and founder of the Florida East Coast Railway. He built or bought a number of resort hotels along the east coast of Florida to attract winter tourists to this great region of Florida, and also brought him a lot of income from the passenger service that he provided. He built what some have called the eighth wonder of the world, the overseas railway that ran from Miami to Key West. That road was completed in 1912 and was completely destroyed by a devastating hurricane in 1935. Mr. Flagler died only a year after the completion of the road to Key West in 1913. Next slide, please. Our second Baron was Henry Plant. Mr. Plant was born in 1819. He was a businessman, entrepreneur, investor involved in many transportation interests and projects, mostly railroads in the southeastern U.S. He came south in 1853 and established express lines on various southern railways. In 1861, he organized the Southern Express Company, and in 1879, he purchased his first railroad, the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad of Georgia. In 1882, he organized the Plant Investment Company to control the railroads that he had purchased, and later established a steamboat line on the St. Johns River. He also connected the Tampa Bay area and Southwest Florida to the nation's railroad system and established regular steamship service between Tampa, Cuba, and Key West. Next slide, please. To promote passenger traffic between 1888 and 1898, he built 8 hotels from Sanford and Ocala south to Tampa and Fort Myers, which started that area's tourist industry. Probably the best known of those hotels is the Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now part of the University of South Florida. Most of his accumulated railroads and steamship lines were combined into the Plant system, which later became part of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad in 1902. And Mr. Plant died in 1899. Next slide, please. Mentioned earlier that there were 6 major railroads in Florida. The 3 that you see across the top, the Atlantic Coastline, the Seaboard, and the Florida East Coast, are the larger of these major railroads. The 3 across the bottom are smaller. The Southern Railway gained access into Florida through the Georgia Southern and Florida Railway when it obtained control of that line. And they had a line that came in from Valdosta, Georgia, south to Lake City, and then southeast to Palatka, and a second line that left Valdosta east into Jacksonville. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad and the St. Louis San Francisco Railroad were both located out in the Panhandle, were much smaller in mileage, and were competitors in that area. So those are the 6 major railroads that we have had here in our great state. Next slide, please. Railroad mergers. That seemed to be the thing back in the 60s. In 1967, the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard Airline merged to form the Seaboard Coastline Railroad. In 1982, the L&N merged with the Seaboard Coastline, and that became the Seaboard System Railroad. And 4 years later, the Seaboard System was merged in with a number of other railroads to form what we know today as CSX Transportation. The Georgia Southern and Florida Railroad was reorganized in 1895 as the Georgia Southern and Florida Railway. A lot of times that was the only major change with the name of the road from railroad to railway or vice versa. And that came under the control of the Southern Railway. That's where they gained their interest into Florida. In 1982, the Southern Railway and the Norfolk and Western Railway merged to form the Norfolk Southern Railway. Through these mergers, many miles of tracks were abandoned to eliminate duplicate or unprofitable routes. So we have these 2 major railroads today, along with the Florida East Coast. And the elimination of these duplicate and unprofitable routes made it possible for the creation of the Rails to Trails program throughout our state. Next slide, please. Rails to Trails, that idea originally began in Illinois in 1965, but Florida was not far behind. The first Rail to Trails project in Florida began shortly after the merger of the ACL and the Seaboard in 1967. Currently, there are 65 biking, hiking, walking trails in Florida with a total of 840 miles of trails. There are 35 current Rails to Trails projects with a total of 440 miles of planned biking, hiking, walking trails. So it won't be long before we'll have close to 1,300 miles of trails here in the state. And many of these current and planned trails are located from coast to coast in Central Florida. Next slide, please. Some of the top trails in Florida you can see listed here, and as well as when we go to the next slide. Again, most of them are in our Central Florida area. Some of the longer trails are close to 50 miles in length. Some of the shorter trails are only a few miles in length. Again, most of these that we've listed here are in our area in Central Florida. Let me just get this off my computer here. Excuse me just 1 minute while I get rid of this Outlook. Okay, got rid of it. Okay, so anyway, these trails again are most of them are here in Central Florida. Next slide, please. Again, here's some more of these trails. Again, most of them being in our Central Florida area. Next slide. Next, we have commuter rail, and we'll talk about three commuter rail entities. The oldest being Tri-Rail, which is a commuter line linking Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. It's owned by the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority, began operation in 1989. It's currently operated by the Herzog Transit Services, and the line is almost 71 miles long and has 18 stations. It operates on former Seaboard Railway trackage. Currently operates 50 trips daily on the weekdays and 30 trips daily on weekends. Fares range from $2.50 to almost $12. And in 2020, ridership was over 2 million passengers. Future plans for Tri-Rail call for a coastal link to be added over the FEC trackage along the coast. Next slide. Our second commuter rail is SunRail, which is a system serving the greater Orlando area. It began in 2014. The system has 16 stations along its 49-mile route that connects DeBary in Volusia County and Poinciana in Osceola County through the downtown Orlando area. And this is former CSX transportation line. SunRail currently operates 20 trips in each direction daily on weekdays only. Prices are as cheap as $1 and go all the way up to $9.50. The average weekday ridership was over 6,300 passengers in 2019. SunRail is planning a 13-mile extension north from DeBary to DeLand, and that is planned for a completion in 2024. They're also looking at a connection to Orlando International Airport that is currently under study. Next, please. Brightline is our third, I'm calling it commuter rail. They like to be referred to as a privately run intercity rail route between Miami and West Palm Beach. They began operations in 2018 over Florida East Coast Railway trackage. As of August 2020, it was the only privately owned and operated intercity passenger railroad in the U.S. 2019 ridership totaled just under 900,000 passengers for the year. They suspended operations in March of 2020 due to COVID, and service is currently scheduled to resume in November 2021 with hourly service. Next slide, please. High-speed rail, that's the coming thing for our great state, and Brightline will be bringing that to us. Brightline is currently building an extension from West Palm Beach to the Orlando International Airport, which is expected to enter service in 2022. The 240-mile route is between Miami and Orlando, and the scheduled travel time will be 3 hours. By my math, that averages 80 miles an hour. So we're going to be moving along. Initially, they're going to have 3 stops with an additional stop planned, and 3 more stops are going to be proposed. The operating speed is 79 miles per hour between Miami and West Palm, 110 between West Palm and Cocoa, and 125 between Cocoa and Orlando. It will be one of the few rail services in the U.S. to approach the high-speed rail standard set by the International Union of Railways of 155.3 miles per hour for new rail, or 124.3 miles per hour for existing lines. They're also currently looking at extending the line between Orlando and Tampa. The latest information that I have seen indicates they hope to be in operation on that portion by 2028. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for allowing me to talk to you today about Florida's railroad history. Again, we've in a short time here, and I apologize for the short time, but I know we were limited on time as well. We've talked about 188 years of Florida railroad history. Also want to take this opportunity to invite you to visit the Central Florida Railroad Museum in downtown historic Winter Garden. Museum is located at 101 South Boyd Street. You're also invited to attend the Central Florida Railway Historical Society or visit them. The society meets in the Central Florida Railroad Museum on the second Monday of each month at 7 p.m. I have listed my contact information here in case any of you would like to get in contact with me. It's crossrails@yahoo.com or info@cfrhs.org. My cell phone is listed there as well, along with the website for the Central Florida Railway Historical Society and the Central Florida Railroad Museum. Again, thank you for this opportunity to present to you today. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
That was a great presentation. Thank you, Phil. I learned a few things too. And I see we have lots of comments in the chat box. Before I reach out to the chat box, Karen, did you have anything you wanted to add before I jump in?
No, I'm just seeing a few comments here. And is anybody seeing instructions that are covering the presentation?
I can't figure out what that might be. I was hoping you might know.
My screen share shows the PowerPoint presentation slide.
Yeah, mine looks good too.
Yeah, and I've got a blue ribbon across the top that says recording and transcription have started, but there is a button to the far right that you can click that says dismiss. Perhaps that might be the instructions Bill's referring to. You can click dismiss and it won't affect anything. But so we have another question. Phil, one question here is, why were there different gauge tracks?
So there were a number of different gauges back in the 1800s, some as narrow as 2 feet between the rails. And then there were 36 inches between the rails. That is what we call standard narrow gauge. We had some of that gauge in Florida. The Orange Belt Railway was a narrow gauge line through Central Florida. Ran from Sanford to St. Petersburg, about 150 miles in length, and it was the longest narrow gauge railroad east of the Mississippi River. Then we had the standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches between the rails. In the earlier years, there were what they called wide gauge railroads. Some were 5 feet, and some were as wide as 6 feet. But then probably in the 1880s, most railroads standardized on 4 feet 8.5 inches as the standard gauge for railroads, but the narrow gauge railroads, the 36-inch and the 24-inch lines, most of the 24-inch lines were in the state of Maine. They remained for a number of years. Currently, there are two that I'm familiar with, narrow gauge lines that still are in existence today as tourist operations. That's the Cumbres and Toltec in Colorado, and also the Durango and Silverton in Colorado.
Great question and great response. I imagine that would be an issue with the footprint not being the same.
Yes, and the railroads had a system devised where they could transfer cars from narrow gauge to standard gauge and vice versa. It was very time consuming and laborious, but it could be done. But I think the main reason that narrow gauge was here in the U.S., narrow gauge lines can traverse very sharp curves, and the standard gauge cannot do that as well. So a lot of the railroads in the West were narrow gauge originally. Of course, all of them have been standard gauge today, but that was the reason for narrow gauge, was being able to operate in tighter situations.
Great, thank you. We have a comment from Kathleen. She says, I think the Tampa Hotel built by Plant is on the campus of the University of Tampa.
That may be. I thought it was South Florida. I could stand to be corrected on that.
Okay. No worries there. Are there places, did I skip a question? Hang on, I did skip a question. Can you talk more about your museum? Do you give tours? Are there docents?
Yes to all of that. The museum is open 5 days a week, 11 to 3, Tuesday through Saturday. There is a docent on duty at all times. We do give tours. You can walk in and get a tour, or you can call ahead and schedule for a larger group for a tour. We welcome tours, and we're glad to have people come by and visit. The museum is in the Tavares and Gulf Railroad Depot that was here in Winter Garden. That structure was completed in 1913 and served until 1969. And then in 1979, the Central Florida chapter purchased the museum and began, restoration of the facilities for a museum and a home base for the organization at that time, the Central Florida chapter of the National Railway Historical Society.
It's a lot of fun, folks. If you get the time to do something different, you can go out on the Green Mountain Scenic Byway and spend some time in Winter Garden and visit the museum. There are a ton of stuff. You'll be in there for hours. It's wonderful. Another question we have, are there places to take train rides on historic trains?
There is a tourist train operation in Parrish, Florida. The Florida Railroad Museum, you can, that has an operating railroad. You can also visit the Gold Coast Railroad Museum down in Miami area. They have a train ride that you can take. There are several what is called live steam operations. It's a miniature train. Most of them are on a 7.5-inch gauge track. They're located throughout the state. You can ride those. They're mostly open on the weekends. I'm trying to think of a couple of, one of them is in Dundee. I can't remember the name of that one. And then there's one that's over just north of Brooksville, I believe it is, that operates on weekends as well. But they are scattered throughout the state. There's another one in Ocala. So those are all, kid-friendly, tourist-friendly. But those are the only ones that they're again, small railroads. The Florida Railroad Museum and the Gold Coast are the only two that I can think of right now that have train rides. The U.S. Sugar Corporation in Clewiston has one steam engine that has been restored to operation. They're in the process of restoring a second steamer to operation, and they plan to offer train rides there. I'm not sure when that will start, but I would guess within the next year they will begin some type of tourist train operation out of Clewiston.
Excellent. And I happen to know there's one in New Jersey. Actually, it's at Cape Hope. Many years ago, I went up there and took my son at the time on a ride. It was a lot of fun. Another question. Oh, here's a comment from Kathleen. Christmas train at kirbyfarm.com in Levy County.
Yes, Kirby Farms is the, I think they took as much of the old 6-gun territory that was in Ocala. They moved that out to Kirby Farms, and they do have events there throughout the year. I know Christmas is a big time. They probably are having one now here in as we approach Halloween. They will have some type of festivities there at that time, and they also do a 6-gun territory day. They have all kind of events going on there, and that is a up and coming attraction here in Marion County at Williston.
Okay, here's a question from Paul. Any chance that Amtrak service between Jacksonville and New Orleans will be resumed?
I think they are in the process of trying to resume the portion between New Orleans and Mobile at this point. Whether it will be able to be restored all the way to Jacksonville, I don't know. The line from Jacksonville west that was owned by CSX, they have sold that line, and it is a short line operation. So whether there would ever be the opportunity to restore that line to passenger service standards, I don't know. I would like to see that.
Yes. Paul goes on to say that he's been on the St. Mark's Trail many times, but he never knew that it was the oldest line in Florida. He said, great info, thanks.
Yes, that was the first railroad, the Tallahassee to St. Mark's line.
That's really neat. I did pass up a question. This one's from Greg. Did the local T&G Railroad merge with the bigger one, or did they just go out of business?
The Tiberias and Gulf Railroad was bought by the Seaboard Airline Railway in March of 1926. They continued to operate as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Seaboard until 1969 in July, when they were absorbed into the Seaboard Coastline Railroad as a branch line, and then the line was abandoned in December of 1969. But they did continue to operate.
Okay. Let's see. Were Plant and Flagler really competitors? Or
not really. Yes, they were competitors, but their lines were not that close together, so they weren't serving the same areas. Flagler served primarily the east coast of Florida, and Plant was more to the interior of Florida.
Okay, thank you. Bill Klein, I think he's responding to my question. He says, no, the instructions are for muting questions, conversations. Okay, so Bill, if you're referring to the ribbon at the very top of the screen, those are the controls for the Teams meeting, and everybody has that on their individual screens to make changes to for their preferences. So that particular line on that ribbon will not go away. I hope I answered that question for you. So Tim says, I was told that there were different gauges for defense reasons.
I'm not aware of that. I know over in Europe, there are different gauges. They do run some 36-inch gauge and 42-inch gauge over there. But I've not heard that before. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's an interesting theory. I think I'll look into that later. Okay, so another question or comment. At a recent state historic marker meeting, there was information that in the 1930s, the train station in Brooksville closed due to the automobile. It seemed odd to me that in the Depression, that autos would take place of trains, but perhaps there was less travel between communities.
The station in Brooksville closed. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, she says the Brooksville station closed due to the automobile.
They possibly in the 1930s and 40s, a lot of the railroads discontinued passenger service on a lot of the branch lines. They were not profitable, so that is a possibility that they closed the passenger service at Brooksville. I do know that freight service, continues today into Brooksville, but of course there's no depot. They've done away with the depot now altogether, but that could possibly be the reason, is that passenger service was discontinued.
Thank you. Bill is back. The instructions are in the middle of the screen and at the lower portion of the screen display, covering half the length of the screen. Karen, I don't know if you can help Bill or not, but I have no frame of reference. He's got things on his screen that's blocking his view, and I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. I don't actually know how to troubleshoot this one, but we are recording this session. Bill, if you can hear me, I did post a link to the Byways YouTube channel, and this video will be uploaded this afternoon for you to view, and hopefully you'll be able to see the entire presentation without anything on your screen. I apologize that you're having some issues with the instructions blocking the screen. I'm not sure how to remedy that.
Right. Thank you, Karen. So we have a question. Where is the closest train station to Titusville that I can go get somewhere in Florida?
Probably you'd have to come to Orlando, would probably be the closest Amtrak station that you could go to.
Thank you. And I think I got all the comments and questions in the chat box. Is there anybody on the call that wants to make a comment or voice their question?
Let me just make one more comment. Greg was, showing the Green Mountain Scenic Byway, and he listed a lot of the towns that were part of the Scenic Byway. With the exception of Mount Dora that was listed, all the other towns were served by the Tavares and Gulf Railroad.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and close out. I'll start by saying thank you, Greg, and thank you, Phil, for the wonderful presentation you gave today. It was very enlightening. And I also thank everybody on the call who dialed in today. And it's because of all of you that the Florida Scenic Highway Program is so successful. We don't have our next chat scheduled at this time. The holidays are coming fast and furious at us. So we'll probably look at 2022 until the next presentation is offered. In the interim, if you have any thoughts or comments or ideas on a presentation, feel free to reach out to me, and we've got some time. We can reach out to potential speakers and get things lined up. So I'm looking at my notes if I have anything else to add. Let me look in the chat box. We've got lots of folks. I think most folks are saying thank yous. Okay, yeah. So folks are really appreciative of the presentation. Okay, so we got a couple of ideas. Steamboats. Oh yes, we actually talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So with that, Phil and Greg, thank you so much. Everybody on the call, thank you for joining us. I thought it was very exciting, and I appreciate you very much. Thank you all for all you do for the Florida Scenic Highway Program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Claudia. Very informative.
Bye. Bye.